Good morning and welcome to the opening plenary of the CIJ Logan Symposium. I'm James Harkin from the CIJ, and this morning I'm joined by Christophe Deloire, who's the director of Reporters Sans Frontières in Paris. Also in Paris, we have Edwy Plenel, who's a veteran investigative journalist and the publisher of Mediapart, which is a thriving internet subscription portal in Paris, which is doing wonderful things at the future of investigative journalism. We're also delighted to have Jan Robinson, who's a prominent human rights lawyer at Doughty Street Chambers, whose clients include, among others, Julian Assange and Amber Heard. First of all, thanks all three of you for your time. Edwy, if you could,
I am here.
We can see he's definitely still there. So first question to you quickly, Christophe. The landscape for journalism is changing. How does that affect the work that you do?
Yes, there is such a change of paradigm of the landscape, especially for technological reasons, that it changes a lot for journalism. In fact, if we have a broad picture, journalism lost a sort of monopoly. Journalists were filters between the reality and the public. And now the public can access a lot of content, a lot of input directly without going through the filter of journalists. A lot of propagandists, PR people, or more legitimately, a lot of entities or individuals use this direct way to the public to spread their ideas. So it could be a sort of, it could weaken journalism. The only solution for journalists is to prove that there is an added value. And it could be something very positive for journalism in the long term. But if there is no need for filters anymore, mafia guys, corrupted people, or at wars, people who want to fight, they prefer not to go through this filter, to go directly to spread their propaganda. And so that's why those filters that journalists are isn't disturbing for them. And that's why they want really to weaken journalism, sometimes to even kill journalists. So we are in a period where journalists are fragilized. There are remaining violations of press freedom, classical ones, sometimes an increasing of those violations through laws, for instance, about terrorism, surveillance, etc. The journalists are really targeted, and journalism itself could be killed by this new technological context. So it changes a lot. As a press freedom defender, a press freedom watchdog, we have to adapt the way we make decisions about who we defend. So we had to establish clear criteria. We had to amend our mandate, and we have to amend the way we work, because geopolitical power relations have also changed a lot. There are new threats, and there are the rules of the game which change a lot. So we have to change the way we work on all those aspects.
Edwy, maybe responding to that, how does journalism, investigative journalism, find its niche then within this new media landscape, and how does that affect the work that you do, the editorial choices that you make?
Hello, everybody. For me, it's a very good time for journalism. Not a quiet time, a dangerous time. Evidently, the context is very hard, barbarian, fanatism, attacks against our freedom, not only from ideology, religious, sectarian, but also from democracy. That's the new reality. In Europe, not only, all over the world, you get power, elected power, not dictatorial power. That's fighting. They are fighting against fundamental rights, against human rights, against freedom of speech, freedom of information, freedom of meeting, of association, of manifestation. It's the case in France. We have a power elected against extreme right. This power make evidently an authoritarian politics. Why I said that's paradoxally, and paradox is sort of paradox, excuse my bad English, but I think you understand. Why I say it's a very good time, exciting time for us, for three reasons. First, and that is for your question, it's a good time to return to the heart of our work, of our profession, investigative. We are not in the commentary, we are not in the opinion. Our work is to find truth of facts. And in our time, all this political, financial, economic power, and they are linked, they built a wall of secret, of lying also. They don't want a free information. They don't want to respect the right to know. And that's the time for investigative journalism. It's not a part of journalism. It's the art of journalism. How do you can reveal corruption? How you can reveal all the money in the tax paradise? How you can reveal violence of police, illegal violence of police against riots, against manifestations? What's your iPhone or the smartphone? And that's the battle now in France, because they want to make a law that's prohibition of all images, all movies of cops who are committed illegal acts. It's the time for investigative journalism. That's the first reason. That's the key of our success at Mediapart. We have this DNA of investigation, and the people understand that. They are of many opinions, but they need this information. To be free, to understand what arrives, they need this free information. The second reason, and Christophe was telling about that, it's the new alliance. I don't think we are in a fragile situation because the public is also in the media. I think it's a new time to make an alliance with the public. The public is in the social network, in participative media. For us, it's the time to return to the heart of the work, and there is the debate. It's you debate free about our information. It's an alliance with the leaks also, with the whistleblowers, with all these people. They are on their computer, they are working in a bank, they are working in other place, and they saw illegal realities. They are hackers. Yes, they are hackers, but they are citizen hackers. They don't make money with that. They saw illegal activities, money stolen for the people, and they want to reveal that. That's Repinto in trial in Portugal now, but that's also all the story of WikiLeaks, of Snowden, of Assange, and other people. They make a peaceful battle against the secret power. They make a peaceful battle with disarm information. We want to know, and if we know, we will be free. First, the art of our work, investigative. Second, this new alliance with the public. But third, and that really, I think it's a good time for that. When you read the story of journalism, even the story at the 19th century, the story of Pulitzer, the story of all the democratic battle at the beginning of the freedom of press. What you see? You see journalists, but journalists that are fighting for democracy. I think it was for us in Europe, quiet, Western Europe, quiet time, very big media, very comfortable, very social comfort. It's a new time to be what we call in French, I don't know the word I don't remember the word, the fantassin of the democracy. We are not only working for information. To be a journalist, really a journalist, not a corrupt journalist, and a journalist at the service of the public, of the public interest, of this very, very important right to know. I think now in our time, it's not a comfortable battle. You are, even if you are not partisan, if you are just journalist, you return to a fight for democracy. It's the case of Snowden. Snowden was not a journalist. Snowden is not a radical, but Snowden fight for the principal value of democracy. And I think it's how do we say that? I think for me, it's a new age of journalism. And that means we are it's a new time to be young. We are youth. We return to the ideal of our work. You know, when you see in France the great speech about freedom of press, I think to Victor Hugo, say, in one hand, you reveal information. You are the eye, that the vigilance of the people against the power. What you say, what you act. I must know what you do in my name. But in the other sense, you are fighting also for a true democracy, for a real democracy. And that's the three reasons for me. Our work, this alliance, and this principal battle for democracy. It's our time, you know, a media like Mediapart, we are very, there is many attacks for the power. We never saw that in the past, see that in the past, very violent attacks from ministers, from member of the government, very calumny in French, very partisan attacks. And for the young journalists in Mediapart, they say, what's arrived? We don't understand why they are so violent. Why they are lying. Evidently, they don't want to discuss. They don't respect our work. The reason, for me, it's they don't trust democracy. They don't want a real democracy. And as journalists, we must now fight for democracy.
Thanks, Edwy. Jen. So the law is still catching up with this changing journalism landscape. How does that affect the arguments that you make in defending journalists and those working around them?
Well, I've been thinking about this quite a lot over the past couple of months, just because these discussions have come up a lot and arguments have come up a lot in the Assange case in terms of the changing ways in which journalism has evolved and the ways in which WikiLeaks has affected that evolution. Because if I think back to when we were negotiating the release of Cablegate, for example, the US diplomatic cables release of WikiLeaks with 5 big media partners sitting around a table, there were two really interesting and anecdotes to reflect on that had me, your question got me thinking about, which was I remember Alan Rusbridger saying to me at the time, Jen, I hope you're documenting all of this because it's extraordinary what's happened. And one day you need to write a book about it. And I said, I don't have time, Alan. And he said, well, just record it, record a voice note. You know, it's very easy. And I said to him, I can't do that. That's not secure enough. And of course, this was pre-Snowden, before people understood the full extent of the level of surveillance that we're all under and how insecure so much of the technology that we use is in terms of what we're dealing with. And the other thing he said to me was, you'll never see media partners sitting around a table like this sharing a story. And of course, WikiLeaks was the first big, the largest sort of leak of information, which was shared with numerous media partners around the world. But of course, that's become the norm now. We're seeing massive projects like this with the International Centre for Investigative Journalists, conducting these massive data projects all the time, all over the world. So I think the way we're engaging in journalism, the way in which the media has adopted and taken on WikiLeaks Dropbox model of journalism, it has changed the way that journalism is practiced. But at the same time, the basics are still there. And in fact, I don't think there has been a big change. What we're seeing, at least, I think one of the biggest issues, and Christophe touched on this, is the variety of ways in which people practice journalism beyond older traditional views of what was or wasn't a journalist working for a media organization, working for a newspaper, working for a television station. Because of the nature of the internet, the way that things are changing, the different ways in which people are engaging in journalism makes it much easier for people to be a publisher, to be a journalist. And I think that's why it is so important as lawyers for journalists, and indeed for the journalist profession, that we talk about the protection of journalistic activity. I think one of the most dangerous debates that we've been seeing, and certainly I've had to deal with over and over and over and over, is this question of whether Julian Assange is a journalist or not. Now, if you want to get into definitions of who is or is not a journalist, journalists do it all the time, to your peril. It's only in undemocratic countries do you have a definition of what a journalist is. That's why it's so important we talk about journalistic activity in terms of freedom of speech and protection. The other issue that I think is really important for us to talk about is the ways in which the law is starting to be used against journalists, and the types of prosecution theories that are being run in various cases around the world. And I'm not talking just about Julian Assange now. We saw the same prosecution theory rolled out with respect to Glenn Greenwald. This is this notion, so historically there's been a very clear distinction. We accept that as journalists, you have an ethical duty to protect your sources. Why do we say that? Because often sources have a legal obligation to protect information. Journalists don't. If you're receiving information from a source, they may well be breaking the law, but you aren't by receiving it and publishing it. That is protected activity as a journalist. What we're seeing in Julian Assange's case, and what we saw in the case that Brazil brought against Glenn Greenwald, is a breaking down of this distinction between the source and the journalist, where a journalist is now, in Julian's case, being accused of conspiracy for having engaged with the source, i.e. by talking to a source, by having communications with a source, which is what journalists do all the time, you could be found to be conspiring with a source in their unlawful act in providing you that information. And that is a dangerous, dangerous path to go down. And I think this is the way in which the criminal law is now being used against journalists, and in ways that we really need to fight back against.
Christophe, what do you think would be the key emerging threats to journalism? There are many of them, of course. Perhaps you want to talk about the French context.
So journalism, in fact, we enter into a decade which could be decisive for journalism, for many reasons, for a coalition, an aggregation of reasons. I mentioned there are many crises, different crises that affect journalism. First, a geopolitical crisis with despotic regimes that do not want just to control news and information in their own countries, but want to change the world media order regarding media. And let's have a look at what China is trying to do. And in our current world, democracies have lost a sort of impact on other countries. In the balance of powers, there is a higher strength for despotic regimes. And these correlations have changed, and this is a huge danger. There is a democratic crisis with a crisis of trust, a higher polarization, and in democracies, new laws to fight terrorism, about surveillance that can affect journalism. But I wouldn't say exactly, it depends, some democracies are now authoritarian regimes. I wouldn't personally say this regarding France. I think we cannot compare with what happens in Turkey, what happens in the Philippines, what happens in many countries. And that it's important to keep a big picture on this and see that in some democracies, even if not perfect, even if too many violations of press freedom, we also keep institutions that protect press freedom, even the judiciary, and even currently what the judiciary in France is doing regarding Charlie Hebdo. Freedom of expression, press freedom is secured sometimes by institutions, whereas some parts of the society want to reduce press freedom. So this is a bit more complicated. There are other threats. I spoke about the technological threat, because for the first time in the history of democracies, due to the technological landscape, the ones who define the principles of the public debate, the rules of the game, the norms even, are platforms, not anymore democratic parliaments. We like, as consumers, we like delegated the management of the public square, of the public space, to platforms. And platforms, currently, without any regulation, they have the power of governments, of parliaments, of the judiciary, of regulatory bodies with the rights of individuals, which is a huge danger. So as citizens, we have to impose to them the respect of democratic principles. And that's how Reporters Without Borders launched the Initiative on Information Democracy. Last year, on the margins of the UN General Assembly, an intergovernmental partnership was launched, signed now by 38 countries. This is a key framework now for the regulation of platforms. And I have to mention that we are now in the process of releasing the first report of our Forum in Information Democracy about infodemics, because everybody says we have to impose responsibilities to platforms. That's true. But the question is, which responsibility? They shouldn't have an irresponsibility framework, but we shouldn't give to them the same type of responsibilities that media outlets have. Otherwise, Mark Zuckerberg could be like the editor-in-chief of the world, having an editorial line. It would be so dangerous. So that's the work we are doing with the Initiative on Information Democracy. You can have a look to have all the elements on the website of the Forum on Information Democracy.
Sorry, Christophe. We'll come back to the role of the platforms, but I wonder, Edwy, you're no stranger to the law courts in Paris. Can you tell us a little bit about strategies that are being used by the opponents of journalism in the law courts? In Britain, we talk about the libel laws, we talk about even laws on privacy, and how those are being used and reinvented and maneuvered against us. Could maybe you say something about that?
Thanks for your question, because I want to say, with all my fraternity and respect, I disagree a little with Christophe. Why? There is a despotic regime all over the world, in China, Russia, Turkey, and worst, Cairo, Saudi, Emirates, and so on. There is despotic regime. They are evidently against all the fundamental rights and equality, freedom, and so on. But there was, in the past, also despotic regime, even worse, with torture, very, very violence against human rights. The question in our time, for the 2 last decades, that start in the United States, And finally, the heritage of what's arrived in 2001, terrorism, it's the politics of violence, to create violence. And finally, after 2001, there was the adventure in Iraq, and the result is the Islamic State, is Daesh. It was a big violence in all the area. That's the great honor of WikiLeaks, Chelsea Manning and Assange, to help the people to understand this criminal adventure. And the result also of this adventure was in the United States, the fight against the fundamental rights, the Patriot Act, the violence of the state. The result was Trump. It liberates racism and so on. And it's not finished with the election of Biden. Why I said that? In France, we are a country really exposed to the disorder of the world in our time, because an old empire, old colonial state with a very big diversity of population. And we are in a time where this politics of fear is acting in our country. With a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. They create monsters worse than the monsters they pretend to fight against. That's why I say I disagree. There is a difference between despotic state, despotic regime, and authoritarian regime. But the question now is that there is democracy, they are fascinating with authoritarian state. Even about internet, they are fascinating with all the technology of control to limit the free speech of the people and so on. Your question, in France now, we have attacks against our secret of sources. One journalist of Mediapart, a journalist of Liberation, recently was kept by the police to reply to questions about their sources, our big secret. That's the guarantee of the right to know of the people. Secondly, we have a good law in France about freedom of press. That's the law, a Republican law at the end of the 19th century of 1881. They want now to take some acts to free speech, free expression. This law, it's not for the press. It's freedom of information, but also freedom of expression. You can say even some opinion that disturb the majority, but it's the freedom, it's the liberty. You know, George Orwell, it was, you quite know this formula. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. That's the protection of the free speech. They take terrorism, they take all this fear in the society to say, if some people say bad things, it's not freedom of opinion, it's a crime. Recently, young boys and girls of 10 years was at the police they say ridiculous things about terrorism, about Islam, about what you want. Okay, they just have 10 years. They was during 10 hours in the hands of the police. That's, and I pursue, I continue. You know, now, recently, the Minister of Interior here, the Minister of Police in France, make an act in law, a pursuit against us about our participative space, what we call the Club de Mediapart, where all the people who read Mediapart can comment, alert, and so on. And that's also an act against all the rules about freedom of speech. The state, they don't want to be disturbed. In fact, their politics of fear, it's the demonstration that the fear is their fear. It's not a very proud power. It's a power very anxious about its domination. And that's my question. My question is, you know, there was bad time in other time, but how do you fight? You are in London. Churchill was a conservative, but he said against fascism, we are hard with democracy, with parliament, with counterpower, with all these principles. And I am anxious about the situation of our democracy. Don't fight terrorism, fanatism, all this threat against our freedom. They don't fight with the rights and the freedom, but they fight with a very authoritarian politics. I want to say, and last point.
Maybe we should bring Jennifer in. Jennifer, do you want to talk a little bit about democracy and authoritarianism and your legal fights therein?
Well, sure. I mean, I think I would have to agree with a lot of what's been said this morning, in the sense that we are, in real terms, I think certainly the prosecution against Julian Assange and the work that they've been doing, which of course their mission is stated as a form of democratic empowerment, that, you know, this is what WikiLeaks does with their publications, and in terms of their mission is about creating greater accountability and ensuring people that have the information they need in order to be able to make informed democratic choices. And so attacking those organizations that ensure that the public has this information is indeed an attack on democracy. And you see that play out in Julian's case. I mean, I'm happy to talk about the ways in which this work is being criminalized and the ways in which this is going to apply to the rest of the media. So we've been worried about this indictment, or the risk of a US indictment, since 2010, since the publications that he now faces prosecution for, 2010, 2011. And of course, this indictment didn't come until the Trump administration. So there was clearly a decision during the Obama administration not to take this approach, because, as we have been warning since 2010, you can't distinguish between the act of what WikiLeaks does and what the New York Times and Washington Post and Mediapart and other organizations around the world engage in. So, you know, if you are receiving and publishing information in the public interest, that is journalistic activity that ought to benefit from the First Amendment and free speech protections. What we're seeing in this case is that the Trump administration is pursuing an indictment which alleges that it is a crime to not just publish, but to receive and possess classified information. That means that even if Julian hadn't published the information, simply receiving and possessing that information is a crime. And of course, that will mean the end of national security journalism. This is an unprecedented prosecution. We've never seen anything like it before. We had expert evidence in Julian's case from First Amendment scholars about precisely this, about the fact that this is new legal territory that we've never seen before. Another interesting aspect that I think foreign journalists need to be very wary of in Julian's case is that not only are they seeking to prosecute him for conspiracy with the source, for receiving, possessing, and publishing classified information, they're also saying that because he is a foreigner, because he is Australian, he will not benefit from First Amendment protections, that as a foreigner, he will not have constitutional rights to free speech. Now, this is dangerous because this precedent actually means if we're not able to stop this here in the UK, this precedent means that any journalist anywhere in the world who receives and publishes truthful information about the United States could face extradition to the United States. So the US will exercise its jurisdiction over you. But if once you are returned to the United States, you won't benefit from First Amendments because you're not American. Now, that is dangerous, and it's dangerous for a range of reasons. We know why. We all see why, which is what the whole world has been gripped by the US election. What happens in America and what the American government does affects so many countries around the world. And if journalists around the world are at risk of prosecution and extradition without constitutional protection for reporting on the acts of the United States government, this is a very, very dangerous situation that we're getting into. And as finally people are starting to see, we saw for years, as I explained earlier, this othering of WikiLeaks, where journalists were saying, well, he's not a journalist. WikiLeaks is somehow over there. It's not a responsible media organization. They're not like us. They're something else. They're not like us. It doesn't matter that they're not like you because the act of what is being criminalized is the same as what you engage in. And to think that this will not be applied to the rest of the media is naive at best. And so I think there is a real question to be asked. I think that, we have, people ask me a lot, well, what do you think about there hasn't been sufficient media coverage of the case or there hasn't been sufficient support? In fact, and Christophe can speak to that, NGOs around the world are fairly united in their opposition. We've got Amnesty, RSF, Human Rights Watch, every single free speech organization you can think of has come out against this prosecution. Media organizations from the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of their editorials are saying that this indictment criminalizes public interest journalistic practices. This is incredibly dangerous. And the question that I think we need to ask is what's going to happen going forward? Is the Biden administration going to pursue this precedent, which is one that is incredibly dangerous and one that the Obama administration clearly took a decision not to pursue?
Edwy, could you say something very brief about the trial of Rio Pinto and its implications? I know you were planning to go to that trial, so maybe you can update us and we can try and trace connections then.
It's the same case. Rio Pinto, as journalists, we must not only support him, but we must say that his work was for the public interest. Jennifer is right. Assange extradition is not only a defeat of the rights of the democracy. If it's arrived, it's a defeat for journalism. And for me, Assange is a sort of journalist. There is many sorts of journalists. There is even corrupt journalists in big media. He served journalism. He find a big scoop, very big information. And that's the case of Rio Pinto, and all the lawyers tried to defend that, and that was the same case with the LuxLeaks about the Luxembourg. It's to say, people like Rio Pinto or like Chelsea Manning, for example, in the story, that they find information of public interest. They don't make blackmail. They don't want money with this information. They don't use this information at private interest. There are new figures with the digital revolution of the journalism. And they need, like our traditional sources, they need a protection. We have the secret of source. We protect our source. we must say that people, and I say, we must name the word, hackers, that make illegal action to find information. But if they made that in a superior public interest, to reveal crimes, to reveal dangers against all the stability of democracy, the equality of the people, the justice, and so on, they must be protected. As journalists, we must find to protect them. It's not say, okay, we have in the past of link with Mr. Assange and we must support him. No, we support Assange. There is, I repeat, there is many sorts of journalism. There is pluralism in the journalism. And so, yes or no, Assange and WikiLeaks, Pinto, now Snowden, serve in all the world the information of public interest. Yes or no? I say 1,000 yes. And that's the reason we must fight for and really if we pinto the trial and there is a bad judgment against Pinto, like for Assange, it's a defeat for us. It's a big defeat.
Christophe, maybe you could come in on that. I wonder, you know, RSF deals with a very broad and diverse community of journalists, but I wonder, do you have an official position as to whether Julian Assange or Pinto are journalists, or that they simply deserve the protections of journalism because of their services to investigative journalism?
We have a very clear stand regarding Assange. His contribution to journalism was absolutely key. And that's why he has to be defended. And I totally agree, of course, with what Jen said. And we do a lot. We do our best to defend Assange, to avoid that he's extradited to the US. Because clearly, and journalists in the US, even in the biggest media outlets, are perfectly aware that if Assange is extradited, it will be a huge danger for journalism. And something very important is at stake. I remember I spoke with one of the heads of the New York Times recently and asked, what is the biggest danger for you regarding press freedom in the US? And he answered, first, Trump, second, the prosecution against Assange. So I think we got rid of the first one, but not of the second one. So this is why we do work a lot on this. For sure, we have to work on democracies, to improve democracies. And Edwy spoke a lot about France. In our World Press Freedom Index, we rank France 34th out of 180 countries, UK 35th, the US 45th. So this is not perfect. But just to answer to Edwy, and really I admire the work of Mediapart and Edwy himself, and no need to say this. But in some other countries, in France, we have to fight authorities when they clearly exercise violences against journalists during riots, when they pass dangerous laws. We have to improve the framework for the security of sources, but, and I think this is very important for having a proper political strategy if you want to defend press freedom. We have to really have the good picture. I fear that if a newsroom like Mediapart would be in the Philippines, in Russia, in Mexico, a few journalists would have been killed. And luckily, this is not the case for Mediapart. Of course, we had the tragedy of Charlie Hebdo in France, but the danger didn't come from the government. And 10 days ago, I was in Somalia. I met with people from a radio. 28 journalists of their newsroom were killed, one after one. So I think we cannot compare this. In Turkey and Algeria, the journalists of Mediapart would be clearly in jail. And really without any doubt, because you had newsrooms there would have been lawsuits against Mediapart Mediapart would have been sold to a local tycoon who would have changed totally the editorial line, saying very positive things regarding the government, what Mediapart doesn't do, in one night, and so Mediapart would have been disappeared in 2 weeks. So this is the world we live in. So now the question of political strategy is, who are the allies of press freedom? And we have to enlarge the circle. And of course, we have to work on the models to avoid that models are eroded. And without any doubt, the European Union is the best region regarding press freedom as compared with others. We do work on what happened in Slovakia, what happened with Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, what happens with institutions in Poland and Hungary, trying really to reduce the perimeter of pluralism and journalism. We do work regarding France, UK, I mentioned it, but we also need allies that are not only journalists. And I think this is absolutely key for the future if we want to have a very positive impact. And I think that we all of us, we have the same ideals. I think so. No doubt for me.
Jennifer, do you want to come in on that or talk about allies that journalists can make with lawyers and NGOs?
Well, absolutely. I think, we've been working, I think there's a lot to be done in terms of press freedom globally, obviously. But, just to mention, obviously, RSF has been a huge supporter on Julian's case, and we're very grateful for the work that they've done, including observing the extradition trial and the public advocacy that they've been, vocal public advocacy that they've been engaged in around the case. And I think this model of working together as lawyers with journalists and unions and NGOs is a really important partnership in the pushback against restrictions on freedom of expression. And a really good example of that is the work that we've been doing. I represent the BBC World Service as well. And we've been working together with the International Federation of Journalists, the NUJ, the BBC, and with my colleague Keelan Gallagher over at Doughty Street, in our Press Freedom Media Defence team, working together at the UN, doing UN advocacy for the protection of BBC Persian journalists who have been suffering death threats, all kinds of risk of persecution, the risk of arrest if they return home, asset freezes from the Iranian government because of their work as journalists at the BBC. And that work together, I think, is a really powerful combination to have journalists working with lawyers who can defend their rights, but also working more broadly with their unions and advocacy groups to increase the pressure on the government concerned around the issues that are taking place. And I really do think that we need to think about it in those terms. Certainly in Julian's case, this is not just a straightforward, we go to court, we win the case. It's a very political case. It's incredibly controversial. And without the support of RSF and other organizations like that, and the vocal support of journalist unions like the IFJ, like the NUJ, which we've now had an important letter this week from Michelle Stanistreet to all unions here in the UK asking for their support for Julian and against extradition. And this is the kind of political action that I think is required in cases of this nature, because we're seeing increasing threats to press freedom around the world, including in this democracy. It is embarrassing to me that an Australian citizen is sitting in a high security prison in the UK at the request of the United States in the case that has been described as the greatest press freedom threat. We had President Aliyev of Azerbaijan yesterday on BBC News criticizing the UK, saying, you've got Julian Assange in prison, you can't come and speak to us about media freedom. And this is what's happening if you've got some of the world's biggest democracies who are typically and should be leaders on free speech issues globally having this kind of issue at home. It makes their moral authority to say anything to other countries about their press freedom issues much more difficult. We saw that with the arbitrary detention ruling that we got from the United Nations and the UK ignoring that. What does that mean for the international rule of law and the UK's ability to be able to press those decisions against other countries? And I think there's a real question of hypocrisy and what it means for global media freedom when you see the United States engaging in this kind of behavior. What message does that send to the rest of the world?
Edwy, do you want to come in on any of that?
I will say, I am not, if the criterion is, even if we have the dramatic assassination of the team of Charlie in 2015, to say, as Christophe said, you know, overseas, journalists like Mediapart, you will be murdered, imprisoned. It's not the reality in France. In fact, I do agree. But why I am not so optimistic, why I am anxious, why I prefer to alert, is there is a sort of verbal violence in our countries, in France, other place in Europe, in the United States, in South America, against journalism, against our work. Not violence in the public, in the opinion, violence, official violence. Members of government, members of parliament that calumniate, injure, very, very hard talks against our work. And for me, it's an alert. Why I say I am fighting against a sort of comfort, hypocrisy. United States, no journalists murdered with the Patriot Act and all the politics of fear. But in fact, the American policy creates violence in the world. Collateral murder, the first video linked by WikiLeaks, is the murder of 2 journalists of Reuters. Our country, France, is a big arms dealer in the world, and notably for Saudi Arabia, Saudi Kingdom. And 2 years ago, Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in a barbarian way, and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, want that's this barbarian technique to be against his people. You know, this guy from the social privileged class of the kingdom, is very dangerous because it's a liberal way, a democratic one. He wants more democracy. I want to make an example. Why I say it's only verbal violence in France. Okay, but this verbal violence, it's a caution to a real violence in other places, in other countries that our government support, financially support, military support. And that's, you know, I think democracy, it's a culture. It's not only institution. It's a sort of way of life. It's a sort of common decency, common decency. And we are not in a time in the public debate, and that's a surprise for me, of common decency. It's a very ugly what we heard about us, about journalism. And that's the point. And the other point about independence. Christophe said about oligarchs, but that's a arrive. Yes, Mediapart, we organize our independence. But in France, we have all private media in the hands of oligarchs, not linked to information business, linked to finance, linked to Africa, linked to other industrial activities. And one of them to create that, he made the destruction of the professional tradition of this media, that is Canal Plus in France. And this media now, with channel, the name is CNews. It's a racist media. It's a media, extreme rightist media, supported by one of the richest men of our country, linked to all the official. I prefer to alert now. You know, in the United States, many people think Trump, it's never arrived. The liberation of the racism, of the supremacism, it's never arrived. We are in this reality, and that's my alert. 10 years ago, we never think that a trial against Assange, like a spy, because we make articles about the trial. It's like a Stalin trial with the Wyszynski procurer. It's very, very, very disturbing. I think we must, it's my last word, I think, okay, there is very big reality, dangerous for journalism overseas, and RSF and other organizations, NGO are in the point. But I work in France, I work in Europe, and I'm worrying about the negative signs, the alert signs about our principle and our work and our democracy in this time.
Thank you very much, Edwy. I think we should leave it there because we've run out of time. I think we can all agree that we should stay out of jail for the next 2 years at least. Thank you all so much for your time. Jennifer, Edwy, and Christophe, we're very grateful to have you. Thank you.